Okay, so this is a review of verbal communication. If you want to open up your PowerPoint, that will be great, and you'll be able to follow along with me as we talk about this area. So the first slide says verbal communication. Then it says it's innate, affects reality, and that it can be harmful. Well, definitely it is innate. In other words, it's hardwired into us as humans to use verbal communication. The researcher in parentheses is named Chomsky. He actually did a research project where he paired babies, 50 of them, and he gave them fake words that had never been used before in any culture. And he found that over time they started using it as language with verbs and nouns in a way that they could relate to each other. So we're just hardwired or built to be able to communicate with each other. I never saw any follow-up tests they did afterwards to see if their acquisition of their native language, like if it was English, was any better. But what we know is that we're just built to use language. The second idea is that verbal communication affects the way we view the world. There were researchers in sociology named Saper and Worf, that's what's in parentheses there, and they researched Eskimos in Alaska, and they found that that culture had over 100 different words to describe snow because they're around it all the time. There's always so much snow around and different levels, and since they're exposed to it so much, they grew the vocabulary that they used to describe the differences that they observed. Whereas I grew up in South Georgia, I saw snow that landed on the ground twice as I was growing up. So our vocabulary for snow would obviously, for me, it was like there's snow and not snow, or melted snow. There really isn't many other words to describe it because I wasn't around it a lot. So what we're around in our reality kind of serves as a gateway to us building communication to describe it. So if we're around snow a lot, we have a lot of words. If we're not, we won't. And the third idea is that it can be harmful. I don't need to go into a whole lot of detail here, but there's an example. It can harm yourself in the eyes of others. It can harm you professionally. There's a radio announcer named Don Imus. He lost his job and all his endorsements when he said a racial slur about the Rutgers women's basketball team, and it was one comment out of 20 years, but it was the wrong one to make, and it cost him millions of dollars. There's a golfer that was competing against Tiger Woods, and after the first year Tiger Woods won the Masters, one of the perks or benefits they get is to decide what the meal will be the next year when all the people that have won the Masters get together for a meal. And this other person wasn't really happy that Tiger had won, and out of frustration, I guess, said, well, what's he going to ask for? Watermelon and fried chicken? And it was a stereotype about African Americans, and as a result of that, he lost every endorsement he had with golf clubs, people that made shirts and other apparel for golf, car companies. It just really damaged him in the eyes of a lot of people, and it took a long time for him to get any traction, after that. If you wanted to flip it, you could just say that Tiger Woods has had a lot of impacts from some of his own personal decisions that he's made too. But the words we choose to use with others can obviously harm them and harm us. Now, we talked earlier about Saper Wharf. If you want to go to your second slide, if you had this idea, though, of roads, if I asked you without hitting the forward button on the PowerPoint, how many different words you could think of for roads, probably in a short period of time you would think of a lot. Go ahead and click the enter button, and you can see a couple of times. And you'll see all the different words we can have for road. And if you use the adjective to describe road, like dirt road, etc., you could come up with even a whole lot more. So we have a lot of words to describe roads because we're around different types of them a lot, just like Eskimos are around snow a lot. So again, what we're around helps to describe the vocabulary we have. Sometimes when I've done this exercise in a large class and I've had people divide up into groups, I've noticed that on occasion, the roads they mention relate to where they're from, so that if they live in an area in the Northeast that might have a lot of toll roads, they might be more likely to say that. Or if they lived in the center of Florida where there's a turnpike, they might be more likely to mention that, because again, they hear that more and are around that more. Now we come to the next clip, which is verbal communication from The Little Mermaid. This is on your lessons page that has video clips. If you want to observe this one, you can. And I'll pause for a second, and then I'll begin again after it. Okay, so if you've looked at this clip, what you've seen is that the Little Mermaid has a different word to use to describe an object than what we use. We use words to describe these, and they're using words like snarfblat. And all that goes to say is that the type of language choices that we make don't really matter. There's not only one word that could be used to describe a car. You could call it a couch if you wanted to, if everybody agreed. So the word choice is not intrinsically tied into that object. As long as people agree on it, it's okay. If you click and go to your next slide that's entitled at the top, Language is Arbitrary, you'll see that there's lots of words that if we simply agreed on them and said that's what they should be, it would start to become part of society. So for example, the first one, aquadextrous, doesn't exist, but we could call it the ability to turn on or off the hot and cold water with your feet if you're taking a bath. Car perpetuation could be going over something as you're vacuuming again and again to give it a chance to suck it up, but it just not happened. Maybe even picking it up, examining it, and putting it back down to give the vacuum cleaner one more time. Disconfect could be what's left over after you've hole punched something, the little bits of paper there, almost like confetti. Lactomangulation could be so messing up one side of a carton of milk that you just abandon it because you can't get it opened, and going to the other side and making a spout in the carton with that. Telecrastination would be being by the phone exactly when it rings, but waiting a few rings to make it look as if you have a life or you're busy or you're doing other things. And pupcus could be the residue left on a window after a dog left and had pressed its nose against it. The impression left kind of smoky. So these words don't exist, but simply if we used them enough, they would get adopted into the culture and they could start to function as language. Again, it's not tied into the object, it just has to have kind of consensus from society. So for example, we all know when we say Google now, we're talking about looking someone up on the web. In the past, it was just a 1 followed by 100 zeros. So as long again as people agree, we understand. Facebook 20 years ago wouldn't have made sense to anybody, but it does now because we all agree on its meaning of this website. If you go to your next slide, you'll see it's entitled Language Can Be Labeling or Dichotomous. And all that means is that we have a tendency when we use words to describe extremes more than a vast middle. If you hit the enter button several times till you get to popular at the bottom, you notice there's a lot of adjectives on the left hand side of this slide. Hot, old, wrong, stupid, tall, early, beautiful, popular. And then if I asked you what the opposite of those terms would be, that wouldn't be too hard probably. Opposite of hot is cold. Hit the enter button again. And as you do that, you'll see what pops up on the right hand side of the slide. Cold, young, right, smart, short, late, etc. So it's not hard to find words on either side. The question becomes, how hard is it to find words in the middle? So what's in the middle of hot and cold? You might come up with lukewarm. Old or young? You might say middle-aged. Wrong or right? Average. Stupid or smart? Average. Tall or short? Average. As you start to go through these examples, what you start to see is that we have a lot of vocabulary to describe extremes, or things that stand out a lot, but not as rich a vocabulary or varied to describe the kind of middle where most of us usually are. So that when we're describing a person or an object or an idea, we tend to use ideas that are more extreme than they really are when describing them. All this goes to say is, when we're describing something, we can kind of label it more to one side than the other, because that's where we tend to have more words that we can use to describe them. If you go to your next slide, it's titled GoPack Name Calling Words. This was actually developed by Newt Gingrich probably 20 years ago when he was chair of the House of Representatives. He established a committee that was trying to help people get elected, and in it he published a pamphlet, and he said, use words like the ones that are listed there when you're describing your opponent or your opponent's policies. Just sprinkle them in all the time as long as they kind of tie into or fit what you're talking about. And if you go to your next slide, GoPack Glittering Generalities. He said to use these words when you're describing yourself and your policies all the time. To consistently sprinkle them in, to place them in and use it when you're talking about yourself and what you believe in. So the idea would be that over time, if you keep using these glittering generalities for yourself and name-calling words for your opponent, that you're starting to influence people that are listening to you to where they'll view your ideas better as opposed to your opponents. Go to your next slide. It says verbal communication is ambiguous. One of the problems we have is that a lot of times, although we try to be clear, people might not understand us like we wish they would. One reason can be slang or jargon or regionalisms. We understand things different in the South than in the North or other areas of the country. I met someone from Ohio one time, and I was talking to them at a meal, and I had said something, and they looked at me and said, "Please." And I said, would you pass the ketchup, please? I thought what they were asking is for me to be polite about it. But instead I learned that in Ohio and some other areas, please means I didn't catch what you said or hear it correctly. Could you say it again? So there was some miscommunication there because I didn't know what please meant for someone from Ohio. There even might be jargon we could have for Cumberland. People might not know what the gray brick building is, or other terminology we might have, SEPO or ESPO or things like that also. So we have lots of words we might even have at the college that people that aren't from the college might not know. And so because it's not as clear, it can be harder to communicate as effectively as we would like. If you go to the next slide, it says ambiguity also comes out of translation. And it gives an example of a t-shirt maker in Miami when the Pope was coming to visit, and the t-shirt was supposed to say, "I saw the Pope." Instead it says, "I saw the potato." So it didn't sell very great. The second example was the Chevy Nova, a car that was sold in Mexico. But Nova in Mexican and Spanish means won't go. So that didn't sell very well. The translation of the product said the product wouldn't work. And there's many other examples we have like that. There's a Parker pen that was sold that was supposed to say it won't leak and embarrass you, and it wound up using the word in Spanish embarazar, which when translated actually means impregnate. So they meant to say it won't leak on you the ink, but instead it became translated as to it won't make you pregnant. There was a product sold in KFC in China that was supposed to be finger licking good, but instead was translated eat your fingers off. For Pepsi products that wound up getting translated bring your ancestors back from the grave. In Africa, they sell products a lot of times that have picture labels on it of what's inside. So when Gerber baby food was sold in Africa, and it had a picture on the label of a baby, it almost caused riots in some stores because they thought there might be a baby inside or parts of one, and didn't realize it was just food for a baby. So because we have problems with translating, that can create issues also. The next slide you have says ambiguity also comes from euphemisms. Now I'm not going to give you a lot of examples, but you can probably think of several that you could use for each of the words listed on that slide of what they mean, or different words you could use to describe them. And we're not all familiar with the different ones that are available. Sometimes we don't like to talk about uncomfortable things, so we come up with different words instead. But if someone isn't familiar with it, they won't be able to understand it. So these euphemisms can make communicating effectively or in a way that another person will understand difficult. There's a clip you can look at on your page also of Monty Python the Dead Parrot sketch, and it has lots of different words that are used for death, up to about 2.5 minutes in or so, I believe. It has a time frame listed on the links page, again, for video and audio clips for week 3. And that's what the next slide is. It's a part of the one for Dead Parrot, but you'll have to go to the links page to look at that on YouTube. Your next slide is entitled Ambiguity Also Comes from Verbosity. That means using complex words when you don't need to. You might have had classes where professors used ones that had lots of syllables of words when simpler language could have helped. So these are examples of common sayings. The first one is, "A rolling stone gathers no moss." Some people wouldn't get that because you can make it harder to understand. The second one, if you want to look at that for a second, would be, "Don't count your chickens before they hatch." The third, if you hit enter again, is "Too many cooks spoil the broth." The fourth, people usually tend to get this one, is "Curiosity killed the cat." And the last one is the hardest. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So several ways, and those are just a few, where we can make it harder for someone to understand us just because we use more complicated words than we need to. You can skip the next slide. We aren't going to talk about that. And finally, that brings us to how we talk in regards to gender. And you can go ahead and hit the enter button a couple times to where it ends with problems on that slide. And we know from research that most of the time, actually, men and women talk the same. There really aren't that many differences. There's a lot more similarities. But there are some, and from research we found that women are more likely to be able to talk about their emotions or be emotionally expressive when compared to men. They're better able to listen or be empathic about other people talking about their emotions. They tend to use tag questions, like at the end of a sentence say things like, what do you think, or how about you, or do you know? Things that almost verbally tag the other person to say it's your turn to talk. And that they can respond expressively to how other people feel. And men are more likely to interrupt, give minimal responses, like one words like, uh-huh, yeah, sure. To not be able to express how they feel, or empathy. To reroute or change the conversation from what it is at the moment. And the last one's called instrumental when others talk about personal problems. And it just means that instead of relating to it or trying to talk about how they feel, instead you tend to jump ahead and talk about what you should do about it or how you should fix the problem. And instead, in a lot of times, what's being looked for by the other person is to agree with how they feel more than what they should do to fix it instead. So we see some of those differences that we have. And it's not exactly, some of those might be environmentally caused. There was research where they actually looked at elementary kids in Australia. And they noticed that as they grew up, though, men tend to curse more on the playground than the girls did. So maybe some things are probably cultural, we could definitely say. It's probably still being studied. I don't think we know for sure about that one way or the other. And we'll skip the Sandra Bim's typology one at the end, which brings us to the last one, how to improve verbal communication. One idea is, again, as it mentions also in your book, is a dual perspective. So that just means that as you talk, you try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and think about how they feel also before you talk, so that you're other-centered and not just you-centered. The second one is that you own your thoughts or statements. So in other words, say like, I feel, or I believe. In other words, you're not saying everything is a fact, but just how your impression of it is. So at least if they talk with you about it, what you're doing is you're owning up to your own feelings about how you feel, and it's not something that can be argued with as much. The third idea is to qualify what you say. So in other words, static language would be things like you always or you're never, things that are almost like absolutes. And using those things, if you did with someone, like if you said you're never on time, their first reaction would be to point out, even if they weren't a lot, the couple of times they were. And so it's just easier to say, you're late a lot, or you were late 3 times this week, or to say, using indexing, in other words, to specify what you're talking about. So it helps to avoid the other person being defensive, and it makes you look more objective about what you're talking about. So those are some things that can help your verbal communication overall too. That's the end of the chapter on verbal communication. I hope that helps a bit. And with that, we're done. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put it on the frequently asked questions part of our lessons. Otherwise, I hope that helps a little bit. And that's verbal communication